So this is another movie on importing data from another data source called an XML file. Extensible markup language is what XML stands for. We're going to begin by creating an XML file using Microsoft Access, and then we're going to import the data into Excel, and then we're going to import the data using the XML source task pane, which gives you a little bit more control over which fields you're going to import into Excel. And then because we're creating a connection, we're going to change the source file and then refresh the data in Excel. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to create an XML file using Microsoft Access. And even if you're not that familiar with Access, it's a fairly easy thing to do. So first I'm going to select the data, press Control A to select the current region, and then Control C so that I copied this data into the clipboard. And now we're going to open up Access. And this may be slightly different for you than it is for me, but it should be in the Microsoft Office folder, Microsoft Access 2010. And to do this, just double-click Blank Database. Access will open up and present you with the opportunity to create a table. Press Control V. Microsoft Access tells me you're about to paste 93 records. That's fine. That's what I want to do. Are you sure you want to paste these records? I'm going to say yes. And then the next thing we have to do is save this table. Control S. Access will assign a generic table name, which is Table 1. That's fine. I'm just going to accept that. And finally, we're going to go to External Data. And then in the Export group, left-click XML File. And then browse to a location that's easy to find. And many times it's just the desktop. Save, left-click, OK, acknowledge that. There are two components of an XML file. There's the data, and there's the schema. It's a bunch of technical information regarding the data. Export both of those, left-click, OK. And finally, and this is some Access functionality, we're going to save these export steps because we're going to do this again a little later on in the movie. So left-click, Save Export Steps, Save As, Export Table 1, the generic name, that's fine. And leave Access open. And now we're going to head back to Excel, and I'm going to left-click and make cell L9 the active cell. So we've created an XML file. So how do we pull it into Excel? Well, there's two ways to do this. The first way is to go to Data, and in the Get External Data group, left-click the From Other Sources, and then left-click from XML Data Import. The next thing we're going to want to do is go find the file that's on the desktop, which is Table 1, the XML document, left-click Open, and Excel asks me where I want to import the data. Do I want to import it where I currently have the active cell, to another existing worksheet, or to a new worksheet? I'm going to import it right to where the active cell is. And since not only are we pulling in data from the XML data source, we're also establishing a connection to that data. So there's some property settings that we can change if we want to. The data source is checked, Save Data Source Definition in Workbook. That will establish a connection to the XML file. And then we have some options about column width settings, and at the bottom, when we're refreshing or importing the data, we can overwrite the data with new data, which is the default setting, or we can append new data to the existing XML table. I'm going to leave all the default settings in place, left-click OK, and then left-click OK. And Excel uses the data from the XML file and creates a table. And it also created a connection, which is right there, to Table 1. So since this data is connected to the source, if the source changes, we can refresh this table and pull in the new data. We're not going to do that quite yet. First, I want to show you a different way to get the data. And I'm going to remove the connection. Okay, and then I'm going to close that dialog box and then select the table and delete the range and start all over again, because there's actually maybe a better way to go about doing this. I'm going to open up this file directly by going to Backstage File, Open and going to the desktop and selecting Table 1, left-clicking Open, and I have a couple of options. The radio button to open up this file as an XML table is selected by default. I can also open it up as a read-only workbook, as you see. And the third option, which is the one I want to show you, is use the XML source task pane. Left-clicking OK, we get the XML source task pane. An XML file is a text file that has structure. There is markup language that identifies the components of the content and labels each one of those components so that each record has an identity, and then each field within that record has an identity. And what we are looking at in the task pane is a list of all the fields that's contained in that XML file. What this enables me to do is select the fields that I actually want to pull into Excel. I don't have to take all of the fields. I can take some of the fields. And I can also arrange the fields differently than the way they're listed in the task pane. In fact, I don't even have to line the fields up next to one another on the same row. If you do want all of the fields, you can select the upper level folder and then drag it over, and when I release, I'll have all the fields selected. So instead, I'm going to delete that. Let's say you want only the industry name, and you want the EBIT divided by sales, and you want that displayed up here, and you want the net margin next to the industry name. Like I said, you can mix and match and rearrange these fields however you see fit. And after you're done, you can refresh the data in one of a number of ways. One of the ways is to right-click one of the fields, hover over XML in the drop-down menu, and left-click Import. Select the table that the data is coming from, and then left-click Import, and we import the data. It's not formatted, but of course this is Excel, which is great at formatting data, and you can format this data to your heart's content. It pulls the data in, again, in a table. So since we have two non-contiguous ranges, we've created two tables. The first one I selected, the name is Table 2. That's the default name assigned by Excel. The other one, it assigned a name of Table 3. So going back to Access, if the data should change, and what I'm going to do is delete by selecting and dragging, holding down the left mouse button, pressing the delete key, telling Access that in fact, yes, I do want to delete that data, and then exporting the data once again using our saved export step. And this is why we saved the export step early in the movie. We're going to run it. Do I want to replace the existing file? Yes. Access confirms that it's finished exporting the table. I'm going to acknowledge that. And then we're going to go back to Excel, and we're going to refresh the data. So not only does the XML format allow you to select whatever fields that you want from the data source and to orient those fields how you see fit on your worksheet, but it also, as we said, establishes a connection to the data source so that when it changes, you can refresh your worksheet and pull in the current data from that source. So that's using the XML file type as a data source. We first set up an XML file or created one using Access by exporting the data that we put in a table in Access into an XML file format. We then went back to Excel and imported that XML data and created a table on our worksheet. We then pulled the data into Excel by going to the XML file directly and opening it up where we had the option to open up the XML source task pane. That task pane gives us a lot more options and flexibility when we're importing data from an XML file, where we can select the fields that we want and the location of those fields on our worksheet. In either case, when you import data from an XML file, you establish a connection so that when the data source changes, that you can refresh the data in your worksheet and stay in sync with the data source.